And one of the things I noted, one of your heroes you've listed and wrote a nice article about was Steve Cannon. Now, I'd love to know a little bit more about your relationship with Steve and why you think he was so endearing to you.
Yeah, it's an odd thing. I came along very late in that guy's life, and somehow very quickly, I still sit back sometimes and wonder how this happened exactly. Very quickly grew very close to him, and I don't know. I think toward the end there, I think I was the only one he was seeing, and I was always a little curious about that. You always wonder, when a guy's lived a long life and a public life, why at the end he doesn't have a bunch more people to hang out with. He was a real loner at the end.
Tom, do you think it was because he trusted and liked you and wanted to maybe share those radio secrets that made him so successful? He saw something in you that he didn't see in all these other people that he thought...
I'd love to think that, but I think it was that I was perfectly content to sit in Steve's kitchen and have him hold court. I didn't need to say anything. I had no interest in saying anything. I enjoyed listening to him, and if he had 3.5 hours of things to say to me, and I got just 5 minutes in at the end, that was okay by me, and I think he liked that. Just to give you a story how it might not go so well with others, I ran into Keeler one time, Garrison Keeler, and Steve Cannon was his hero. And Keeler said, "Boy, I'd like to meet him." And I said, "Okay, I got to warn you, when you meet Steve does most of the talking." And Keeler's face turned, and you could see him think, and all of a sudden it was, "Oh, well, forget it then." It just, he no longer wanted to meet him. And I think maybe Garrison preferred to do most of the talking, because kind of when you're with him, that's how that goes too. And I hadn't gotten to a point in life yet where I wanted to do most of the talking. I still really enjoyed listening to, if you're an interesting person, listening to someone else talk. And so I'd sit and listen to Steve, and then I'd go home. And then he'd call later that night, and it would start again, sometimes for a couple hours.
You never saw him do the whole show, his show in studio, did you?
No, I never. You know, Steve wouldn't allow people to see his show. You know, he even when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame, the Minnesota Hall of Fame, Broadcasters Hall of Fame, they said, "Steve, do Morgan," and he wouldn't. And they said, "Come on," and he didn't allow anybody to watch him. I mean, and finally they said, "We're not letting you go till you do one of your characters." And he said, "Okay, hit all the lights." And they had to turn all the lights off in that auditorium. So he was very protective about being seen, doing his show. I know the fair was something that drove him insane, because when he got out there, he couldn't do his characters. He didn't want anybody seeing. He really, I don't know to what extent this is really true, but his family told me he really thought of those characters as being real. And if you were to see him do them, they wouldn't be real anymore, and yet they were real. So it was almost murder to have people see that they're not there. So no, I never saw him do his stuff, but he was a wildly unique person. Just his whole life. You know, I'd sit when a guy talks as much as Steve does, you hear his whole life story. I mean, the very first time I met him, I heard his entire life story from birth, everything.
Wow, he just kept telling you all of it, huh?
I know every woman he was ever with. I mean, I know all of it.
Tell me one. Come on, tell us
one.
I'll
tell you one story that Steve was unable to tell on the air, but
yeah, he's dead.
Steve was from the Mad Men era, you know, and you could you could sort of get away with things with other women in the office that you couldn't today. There was one buxom secretary who apparently had the job at CCO of opening the studio door for Steve at the end of his show so he could walk out. Now, you and I, Carl, we're from the era where we open our own doors.
Yeah, sign me up for that, boy.
Yeah, so this woman would open the door for Steve, and as he'd walk by, he'd hold his hands lovingly just above her breasts and sort of turn his hands as though he was turning a dial, and he'd say, "Honey, just once let me dial in Tokyo." A lot of guys don't know what the hell that means, and I don't really know what it means either, except I'm sure at some point there must have been some reference in World War II or something to turning dials and bringing in Tokyo. But that's Steve right there. You know, I just don't know how many people would have done that. But he was a cool guy. You know, when everybody else in the 60s was into, well, whatever they were into at places like CCO and KSTP, they weren't into jazz, and Steve was, and they weren't into Lenny Bruce, and Steve was, and so he was pre-hippie, but he was the hippest guy of the pre-hippie era.
Sure, that sounds like a good description of Steve Cannon in his early days. We're talking with Tom Mischke of the Mischke Road Show, debuting May the 12th in 2014. And I understand, Mischke, that's going to be at O'Gara's, because you play music and you're going to have a little activity going on there. Is that true? Yes or no?
Yeah, on the 8th of May, there's going to be a kickoff party, which in essence is turning into a fundraiser of sorts for the show, because there's a tremendous amount of money that has to be spent to get started on this, and there's very, very little money that comes in the beginning, because you can't go charging people when you don't even know how many listeners you have. So there is a show at O'Gara's that I'm doing with Mike Gunther, who's a great Twin Cities singer-songwriter, and that's May 8th, and we'll stick you for $10 to see that show, and hopefully end up with enough to cover website costs and equipment costs. And I actually have to buy a car for this, because the amount of driving, if I were to use the vehicle I have, it would be a wash.
Yeah, well,
add in gas. So I got to find something that gets good gas mileage, and there's a lot. And I haven't been working since last August. You can imagine how much money I've saved. So that's going to be May 8th at O'Gara's. That'll be an entertaining show. I'll sure try and make it entertaining.
Now they're going to play some music, yeah, and you're going to tell some jokes.
Audience participation stuff, and some weird live theater, and just a massive amount of nudity. Yeah. Most of it involving Don Shelby.
Nudity and probably free beer, right? Tomorrow.
I like to think I'll buy everyone a beer. I like to think that.
Yeah, well, you can do it. Everybody doesn't care either way. They want to come support you.
You can do anything that you desire.
Yeah, it's a fun time. It's what
Carl, I hear that music and I think of you. I think of you doing aerobics with, I think, who would you be with? Olivia Newton-John.
Oh.
In a video, you and her and that music playing, and you're in a kind of a Borat-type swimsuit leotard deal.
Oh, yeah, I don't know who he is.
And Don Shelby appears, and the whole thing is turned into a DVD and sold out in San Francisco.
Yeah, we should do that. That's something you've got to do, get creative with this kind of deal and get people on board. I'm sure you're going to find characters, Tom, like that called your show in the old days, which we're going to get into in a minute. We've got some old audio. We want to go down memory lane with Tom Mischke. And I think they've got things from KSTP and going back as far as 1996, 1995. And WCCO, I think they have all till today. And I know they wanted to share a story about you at City Pages, but now listen, these people that you've dealt with your whole career, they're going to come and support this, right? You're going to go down to Fury and pick up an automobile and drive it around and tell about it, right? Isn't that how it's going to work?
The boys at Fury have already let me know they want to talk to me. Marky Moeller, my dear friend, has already told me he wants to talk to me. I don't know how your deal works, but you can't go to them before the show starts and say, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have 100,000 listeners, so let's roll, boys. I mean, if I were them, I'd say...
Yes, that's what you've got to do, Tom. This is what it is. There's 6,000 people listening to you right now.
You have 6,000?
And people that don't even live here don't know anything about you.
Hey, Carl, guess what?
Yeah.
You have more listeners already with your show, which is very new, than I had at City Pages. The City Pages experiment, for the record, was a disaster.
Really?
It was a disaster. I ended up being paid, in essence, for my column. But the podcast was a disaster. That's why I don't go into this thing with... I go into this thing taking... I don't know how to put it. I see it as an experiment that could fall on its face. I just don't know that this thing's going to work. I'm not wildly optimistic. I'm trying not to be pessimistic, but I'm looking at this like one looks at... Oh, what did someone tell me one time? You start a company in America and 70% of them fail after 1 year. That's kind of how I'm looking at my deal. I got a 30% chance of this thing working.
Well, that's good to be like that, but I'll tell you, back in the days when I've seen the information about why it works today, and while there's 6,000 people who I don't know that are listening from all across, they've got IPUs from all over the world. They tell me, they can show me, but I don't care. But they didn't have the smartphones back then, Tom.
Yeah, 5 years ago, I was told I was starting it just a little bit too early. The other problem was I was at a website that had absolutely it wasn't known at all for podcasts. I was at a print medium. There was nothing about podcasts associated with it. It wasn't where people went for podcasts, and I don't know. I found the whole thing. The one thing I love with this is I'm not building a studio. I mean, I spent thousands of dollars building a studio, and then saw it, in essence, go back to a closet about 12 months later. I'm looking at it right now. There's just clothes in there and shoes. It was quite odd. The column was a thrill. I had originally been a freelance writer, so I loved writing the column because they let me make it up. One of the great joys of City Pages was I wrote columns as though real things were happening, but I made it all up. And then I'd get calls. I got calls from Oprah. I got calls from the NPR The Story, wanting to interview these wild people I wrote about as though they existed. And I'd say, well, I made that up. And they say, well, you couldn't have made it up. I saw the photo of the guy in the column. And I said, yeah, I just got that from a stock photography catalog. And they said, well, that's completely unethical. I'm going to go to your editor and get you fired. I said, okay, go ahead. Kevin Hoffman knows all about it. So they'd contact the editor of City Page, and Kevin would say, yeah, I know it's a little bit odd. We just let Mischke do whatever the hell he wants. And they'd just flip out. And that was more fun than the show. The only good thing that came out of the show, and it's really, if there's gold that came out of that year, it was, I thought maybe I'd get calls. I didn't realize that podcasts were all listened to after the fact, rarely live. So I thought, well, I'll be getting calls. I better put a phone line in. So I put a phone line in. Of course, never got any calls except from bill collectors. The phone I got, the number had belonged to people who owed a bunch of money to banks and other places. So I'd be doing my show, and the phone would ring, and it'd be someone in India. Collect money. Well, I don't know if it applied there. So I'd get these calls, and I'd say, well, let's milk this for all it's worth. And those calls are still available at MischkeMadness.com at that site Derek Larson has. And that made that year worth it. Just to talk to these guys from India and be able to freely say, you're not going to get your money, or I'm going to pay you in chickens.